Hello, everybody. How you doing? This is Anthony Cosenza with the Orange and Black Inside. What happened on Monday night? It kind of seems like a broken record with the Bengals and the Pittsburgh Steelers. We'll talk about that. We'll talk about a lot of things that's going on with the Bengals, as I don't want to say now with 7 losses, we are fully looking ahead to 2018, but with this loss on Monday night, unfortunately, it kind of seems that way. And for the first time in a while, I've missed my co-pilot here, my navigator in the cockpit of the Orange and Black Insider jet airplane. I don't know. Maybe you're into trains more than jets, I guess, Scott. But Scott Schultze is with us tonight, and I am so happy to have him. Scott, first of all, how have you been? How was your Thanksgiving? And then we'll get to something in just a second.
Okay. Yeah, it was, as you mentioned about the trains. Yeah, I think I missed the last couple podcasts ago because I was doing something called rail fanning.
Okay.
So I assume most people have no idea what that means, but my son is really into trains. So
okay.
I missed that one because we did not get back to my hometown in time. And so we were rail fanning. I think I was sick before then, and then we skipped for Thanksgiving. So it is nice to be back to get the headphones on and get talking some Bengals. Even though the last game wasn't that great, it's still nice to be chatting with Anthony Cosenza and having some people listening to us on YouTube and on SoundCloud and all that cool stuff, and hearing what we have to say. And hopefully it's inspiring, useful, or whatever. And if you have any questions what rail fanning is, I guess you can ask us that in the questions section.
You know what, Scott? Before I kind of toss it to you for a fun little short segment here, I want to say you kind of brought up the listeners and all of that. I just want to. We got a tweet today when we were promoting the show. Our listeners are awesome because the Bengals haven't, since this show has started, the Bengals haven't been very good. I mean, to be quite frank with you, we've grown into trying to create this show, and there's been some audio issues, there's been some other issues, but we try and deal through all of that. And the point of this show, though we try and be as objective as possible, because we write for a site and there's kind of a journalistic side to this, I guess, but down deep, I mean, you look at if you're watching us live or you're checking out the video later on, you can see Scott is wearing a Cincinnati Bengals sweatshirt. We're Bengals fans, and we hope that this team wins. We hope they do well, and sometimes doing this stuff can become a little, I don't want to say tedious or anything like that, because we enjoy doing it, but it becomes hard when the team isn't winning, when we're aggravated, much like Bengals fans in general are aggravated. But Scott, I just wanted to share that Trigger Jones on Twitter at _Jones, and unfortunately I don't know who Trigger Jones is in their YouTube account. Maybe he or she continues to join us live, but just in putting any Bengals fan should watch. And I was really down and angry about what happened Monday night, and hearing that just kind of, even a positive little comment like that lifts the spirits and makes. I just don't want to let that go unappreciated, because that makes this kind of stuff worthwhile, and I wanted to relay that to you too, Scott.
Awesome.
Yeah, I thought it was really cool. Just occurred this afternoon, but. Before we get to the Steelers, before we get to other topics we've got on deck with the Bears game coming up and all kinds of other topics to debate, we're going to start the show with a history lesson. And we've done this a couple of times on this show because, for those of you that know Scott Schultze, for those of you who know me, we're a little bit of history buffs. I was a history major. Scott is really into the I get, what would you call that? The sainthood, the historical context of the Renaissance and Reformation and all of that. What?
I'd say very much just, I'm a huge history fan of like antiquity.
There you go. That's the hot word.
Yeah, that whole era.
Okay, so for those that are tuning in live, today is
The feast
Saint
day
Nick's
of
Day.
Saint Nicholas. Yes.
Okay, and what is that, real
Um,
quickly?
so the first thing I want to say is if you have Christmas stockings out, hanging by the fireplace, if you have one or wherever, if you're waiting until Christmas to fill them, you're doing it all wrong. They're supposed to get filled tonight, or yeah, actually last night. Uh, anyway, Saint Nicholas, and I'm sure many people have heard various stories. He's the fat guy in the North Pole with all the reindeer that fly in the air and all this. He was actually a real person. He was raised in a devout Christian family in the 3rd century in Patara, which was Greece, is now part of Turkey. He had wealthy parents who died when he was young due to a plague or an epidemic or something like that, and left him a large fortune because of his Christian faith. He used that fortune and gave it away to the needy, the sick, the suffering in his area, but he did it in secret. So it wasn't, one of these showy things. Like he would kind of secretly pay for things for people to get schooling, clothing, food, that kind of stuff. And one of the more famous stories of doing that was, this is back in the days of dowries, when if you wanted your daughters to get married, you had to give money. You had to pay so much to the husband's family for them taking on your daughter, I guess. And if you're poor, it was very hard for you to provide a dowry. So he got a little bag of gold or whatever it would have been, and had tossed it in the window, and it's a little warmer there in the Mediterranean, and kind of secretly at night, the guy's stalking outside, but instead of stealing, he was putting stuff in. And I get the story, as the story goes, it landed in the shoe. They had shoes sitting by the fireplace to dry them out or whatever. And they found this and they were excited. The daughter was able to get married. And I think he did it another time for another one of their daughters. And at some point, I think they figured out who it was, and he ended up being named a bishop in a different town called Myra, which I think is also part of Turkey. So Mediterranean area, no snow, no elves, no reindeer. Anyway, because of that, this tradition sprung from that time period of, getting gifts on the feast day of St. Nicholas, which is today. And so people would set out shoes, and you'd set them out by the fireplace, by the front door, and kids would wake up the next morning. They'd find little candy, little gold coins, or chocolate, pretend gold coins, or fruit, something like that. And of course, in America, instead of the shoes, it's more like the stockings. But most people hang the stockings up and they wait till Christmas Day, and you have them. In addition to that pile of stuff you have under the tree. Well, and if you do it right, you should be getting the stocking gift today, and then you get the Christmas gift, in 3 weeks. So it's kind of like that little something beforehand. And I don't want to go too on, but another thing people are doing wrong is all the Christmas. Yeah, I could go on all day. So I need to cut myself short, because the Christmas season technically begins on Christmas. It doesn't end on Christmas Day. So you don't have to take everything down and throw everything away and stop the Christmas music on December 25th. That's when it technically starts. Like now we're in Advent, and then it goes to Christmas season. Mm-hmm. Anyway, one interesting side story about about St. Nicholas and how this ties to football, if at all. And well, it really ties in if you consider the Bengals game against the Steelers, which was a little brutal. There was the churches had councils through various years where they tried to define doctrines and different things. They had a council in Nicaea back in 325 AD. And there was this heretic named Arius who was preaching that Jesus wasn't the way we understand him the way Christians understand him today. Is like, fully God, fully man, divine. And Nicholas got so frustrated with this heretic that he actually punched him. And there's debate whether he punched him, slapped him, whatever. But it's still kind of cool, because you think of these saints, you think of these like, cherub, kind of happy, peaceful, St. Francis petting all the animals. And here's this guy, and I don't know how bloody it was, but, St. Nicholas was like, I'm tired of your heresy. I'm tired of this crap. Just bam, clock.
Just straight up badass. I like it. Yeah.
So in honor, I guess the Bengals Steelers game, and this being St. Nick's Day, you still have a couple hours to get your sock, unless you're listening to this on podcast. And if you listen to it live, hurry up, get your stocks out. Get a gift or something in there, and and go St. Nick.
And obviously the punching and all of that is very apropos with what. Yeah. With the Bengals and Steelers, and whether or not you celebrate Christmas or have certain religious beliefs or anything like that. Obviously, this is kind of historical context that has some religious ties, but whether or not you celebrate it or whatever, I think everybody can recognize that this time of the year is usually a time that symbolizes giving and doing, charitable works and all of that. And obviously that's who St. Nicholas embodied based on the historical context there. So that is this week's history lesson, courtesy of Scott Schulze. And it's kind of an old school church-based like Robin Hood kind of tale, right? I mean, he was kind of going after people and, giving, it's taken from the rich, given to the poor, that sort of thing. And, it's kind of a cool background. And a lot of people, you hear, oh, St. Nicholas, and you don't really know the background. And obviously we're coming up on Christmas. So, thanks for the history lesson, Scott. You are a wise man. You should have been one of those 3 wise men, my friend.
Probably a little too young for that.
Maybe. All right, buddy. Let's transition into the Steelers game. I don't want to dwell. It's a loss, all right, and I don't want to dwell so much on, the doom and gloom, because I think everybody now understands that the Bengals season is, if it was hanging by 2 threads before this game, it's hanging by one extremely thin one. Essentially, the Bengals need to win out and need a ton of help if they are to get into the postseason. So I don't really know where to start with this one, Scott, because this game reminded me of 2 games in 2015. And obviously that was the year the Bengals had a tied a franchise best 12-4 record. They got to the postseason. They hosted the Steelers. Obviously, the easy one to point to is the wild card loss to the Steelers. But this also reminded me, if you remember this game, the Monday night game that year against Brock Osweiler and the Denver Broncos, when the Bengals got up to a big first half lead. I believe it was 14-3 or something like that. On Monday Night Football, and they looked to be in control with A.J. McCarron at the helm, and they ended up losing that game in heartbreaking fashion. Same thing happened here. Now, I guess I've coached, I've been an athlete, I'm sure you've played sports and all of that. I hate the idea of moral victories, okay? I don't want to say the Bengals should take moral victories out of this, but I guess I'm puzzled at how they lost this game. They had a 14-point lead at halftime on their home turf. They had higher time of possession than the Steelers. They were 50% on third down conversions on offense, whereas they held the Steelers to about 33%. They ran for 130 yards against the Steelers defense, which is very rare for the Bengals to be able to do, especially with their top back, Joe Mixon, out of the lineup for 2.5 quarters. They didn't turn the football over. Pittsburgh did. Really the only major area, and they really did poorly, is penalties. They set a franchise record with 173 penalty yards in the game. I guess I don't understand how they lost this game. And obviously, yeah, second half scoring differential, all that stuff. My point is this just organizational culture, intangibles, and the difference in those areas between these two teams? Is it coaching? Is it all of the above? Or is there a major disparity of talent? I don't know. I want your assessment on this.
I'm going to say all the above just because that's the easiest thing to say than repeating all those. But everything you mentioned, they were in this game, and you look at their, statistical probability to win, whatever their production, how they were doing, they did not look like your typical, the Bengals we saw the first 5, 6, 8 weeks. They were protecting Dalton well. Dalton was making some very good throws. They were running at will. Both Mixon and Bernard were running very well. And even after Mixon went down, they didn't have a letdown. Bernard stepped up. He looked like the Bernard we saw his rookie season, where we're like, wow, this guy's really good. Back when he was splitting with Ben Jarvis, Green Ellis, and we were all screaming for him to get more carries, kind of like how we're doing now with Joe Mixon. We're all screaming for him to get more carries because he looks good and he touches the ball. So, but you mentioned one of the key things is penalties. The 173 yards, is an extra over 100 yards difference. And that is just, you're giving up 100 yards there, and then you're also not, that also doesn't really include the yards you lose. So, okay, you lose 173 yards, but you have all those other yards you gained that are wiped away. So you have like the touchdown that was wiped out, the AJ Green on the phantom, holding penalty on Giovanni Bernard, or, some of the third down conversions the Steelers made because they called pass interference or things where there really wasn't any contact. And, so those things that just kind of kept drives alive and, took points off the board for the Bengals and just, yeah, and I think some of the people mentioned it in the YouTube chat, and obviously they've mentioned it on Cincy Jungle too, is that, yeah, the officiating was just beyond bizarre. And, obviously did the Bengals no favors. I think a more fairly called game, I think the Bengals come away with the victory because they did everything you're supposed to do to win. And I think it's one of those things, like you said, they always seem to find a way to lose the primetime game against the good, teams with the winning records. Although you usually don't expect it to be, something like this, the officiating being atrocious. You expect it to be, the ridiculous, Adam Jones and Vontaze Burfict penalties in the playoff game, or the, Jeremy Hill fumble when they're trying to run out the clock. Just you expect it to be something like that. The officiating was kind of and it was, it was very reassuring as a Bengals fan when you watch the game, and even the national announcers who generally are, supposed to be unbiased, who are just, play after play. Like, I don't know what these officials are calling. I mean, John Gruden multiple times was just seemed to be beside himself with just the absurdity of some of the calls. But you would ask for, is there anything, like any moral victory, anything good? I think for me, the two big, I guess I had three big takeaways. One, they look good. I mean, the team looked like they were in this game. They looked like the better team for the most of the game. They looked like the team that we expected to see when the season began. A team that was fighting in every game, looked good, was playing well. Cedric Ogbuehi, he actually looked like a left tackle and not like a turnstile. That was kind of nice to see. That Dalton didn't get a ton of pressure. Not saying he was Andrew Whitworth by any means, but he looked serviceable like he has for the last few weeks. Giovanni Bernard played really well. Their thing, I think, that might be of more interest to Bengals fans is I think this loss gets us closer to Marvin Lewis's exit. Because I think some people are clinging to the idea, well, they may not get rid of Marvin Lewis. That's not real. Is that the Bengals' culture to get rid of him, especially if to make a big comeback and make the playoffs? This game, as you mentioned, more or less probably seals their fate as far as postseason. And if that's the case, that this might be the game that finally convinces the front office that, yeah, Marvin's 15-year tenure of no playoff victories ends, and this is I don't think he'll be fired this week, but I think this might be one of those things that they look back at, when they decide not to renew his contract and say, yeah, that he's just not getting it done. If that's a positive, obviously not for Marvin.
Well, yeah, I don't think he's getting fired this year. I think they've got a handful of games left to play. They theoretically have a pulse in the postseason, though they're comatose, I guess, if you want to use that type of verbiage. So I don't think he's going anywhere in 2017. I think it's a matter of 2018, and I think I hate to say this, but I really think it might be Marvin's choice whether he either retires or whether he wants to come back. I don't think fans want to hear that. I don't want to hear that, but I don't want to think that. But if he wants to come back, he may have the opportunity to come back for another year, 2 years. I don't know. And obviously I think these last handful of games, kind of determine that, but I don't, nothing has surprised me with this franchise. Nothing has surprised me with Marvin Lewis on this team. And, one of the questions I wanted to ask is basically, is the season over? You kind of said more or less, yes, but, some games to play out. One of the things that I took away, Scott, from this game, I noticed, and granted, Le'Veon Bell had a good game, and he trucked Dre Kirkpatrick at times and other things like that. But one of the things I took away from this game is the Bengals in this rivalry have almost always been out-bullied, out-physicaled, all of that. This game was an absolute bloodbath. And 3 Bengals players had concussions. Shazier had that really scary moment where his lower extremities didn't appear to be moving. Apparently, he's making a good recovery. So whatever you think of him as a football player, as a human being, you want to wish him the best on that. Don't be a jerk and hope he has permanent damage or something. But there was that. Trevor Matakevich, I believe it was Shazir's backup. He came in and he left he couldn't even lift his arm at one point, left the game. There were other Steelers players that left the game. Adam Jones left with a groin injury, a ton of stuff. That's what frustrates me about this game. In so many critical aspects, the Bengals, they were just as physical as the Steelers, which is a first in a long time, in my opinion. They, like I said, time of possession, turnovers. They got to Big Ben. They only sacked him once, but they hit him a lot. Antonio Brown, when covered by the right people, we'll talk more about that in a little bit, was not a factor until covered by one particular cornerback, Dre Kirkpatrick. And, the Bengals, this is what frustrates me, Scott. And I guess, you mentioned Marvin Lewis, and I don't know if you have any additional thoughts on this, but the Bengals, this is what blows my mind. The Bengals only didn't have the lead for 2 seconds of the entire game. 2 seconds, and it was the final field goal that sealed it. And again, you can say, the tie and talk semantics, but I'm saying they had the lead or were tied. I mean, for they were tied or had the lead for every part of the game, but 2 seconds. I mean, is that just a full collapse by Marvin Lewis? And I guess I point to 17-3 at the first half, outscored 20-3 in the second half. I thought Bill Lazor had a good plan in place. His receivers dropped balls. You mentioned in the third quarter a very bad call against Giovanni Bernard that could have been a huge A.J. Green touchdown. I don't know. I guess I'm just really frustrated because, like you said, the Bengals did a lot of things that you would think on their home turf would get them a victory.
Yeah, and I don't know if it's the phantom halftime adjustment thing or what it is, but they just in the second half, the Bengals are not a good scoring team. I mean, we had 2 touchdowns and a field goal in the first 4 possessions. After halftime and 5 possessions, we had 1 field goal. And it was total opposite for the Steelers. They had that field goal at the very end of the first half, and that's another thing, giving up, and at the end of the second half, where they're giving up these, points, kind of cheaply giving up points at the very end, where they just kind of let down. And I don't know if that's a coaching thing or if they're just exhausted. I mean, I hope they're not exhausted because, it's only the first half of the game when they gave up that field goal, and they are, professional athletes, and this is like what they're training for and, do it all season. But, the second half, the Steelers go, or after the first 5 drives, the Steelers go field goal, touchdown, punt, field goal, touchdown, field goal. Now, granted, you held on to field goals. That's good. But, they didn't stop the Steelers on a single 3 and out. The second half, the drives were 9 plays, 4 plays, 11, 9, and 8. And they just, whatever changes they made at halftime definitely worked, because it's just another one of these things where, Marvin's like, there's no such thing as halftime adjustments. Those don't exist. That's like, these elves in the North Pole, stop talking about that. That's not a real thing. But yet, if it isn't a real thing, why is it every game we seem to see the same result, which is the second half, the opponent scores points, and the second half, we stop scoring points? I mean, you can say it's karma if you're Antonio Brown or whatever you want to call it. But yeah, there's clearly something not working. And I know, well, is it just the coaching? If we don't have, does Marvin not have that oomph for that, that leadership, that command? And he probably doesn't. But I have to think it's more than that. It's just, look at the chunk plays they give up in the fourth quarter. They're giving up passes of, 15 yards, 9 yards, 24, 18, 13, back-to-back plays, completion. And then they go down and get a field goal. Then on their last drive, they're getting 12 yards here, 10 yards there, boom, 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 getting down a field goal range again, and then killing the clock. And it's just, and you see it happen game after game, year after year. And at some point, I think you have to point the head coach and say, either your adjustments are wrong, your leadership, something isn't working. And if we just, I think gets to the, one of the main reasons why fans are saying, enough's enough. We just need someone that can do what is not being done under Marvin Lewis.
Yeah. And, you look at the same thing, you mentioned, I mean, even up 17-0, they let up a field goal right before the half. This is what has happened this year and last year. Field goal right before the half, touchdown with with a couple minutes to play, field goal at the end, at last possession of the game to win it. These critical timed possessions before the half, late in the game, at the end of the game, they keep giving up points. And you're not going to win. I mean, even if you play well, especially against a team that was 9-2 like the Steelers, you're not going to come out of with a win there. It's just not going to happen. And unfortunately, the Bengals lose 23-20. I did think it was a little interesting before, when it was, I believe, a tied game and the Steelers still had the ball and were driving. I did think it was a little interesting that they did a SportsCenter preview clip and they said, we'll have an interview with Mike Tomlin, as if that was almost foreshadowing before the result ended up happening the way it did. But the Bengals are now 5-7. They are down the pecking order now in the AFC playoff picture, and unfortunately, they still have proven, whether or not Marvin Lewis stays, they still have proven they cannot, one, not regularly beat the Steelers, and number two, they've proven that they cannot win these big games against good teams on the biggest stages. Which is basically needed for a team to be able to not only get to the playoffs but win in the playoffs. And I feel like it's a broken record, not only what we watched Monday night, but when we talk about this. You can give us your thoughts on the Steelers game and what's ahead for the Bengals. There's already a ton of comments. A Bengals fan that downloads this podcast after we record live, try and join us live when we record and talk with other Bengals fans in our YouTube chat or on cincyjungle.com. Otherwise, you can still download the program on iTunes, on SoundCloud, on YouTube, Cincy Jungle. You can get in touch with the program on Twitter at BengalsOBI and via email, theobinsider@gmail.com. We'd love to hear back from you. Scott, some big news with the Bengals this year, and it has been an absolute disaster of a rookie season for John Ross. John Ross on Wednesday afternoon, after Marvin Lewis publicly told the press that he has a good chance to play against the Bears, hours later was placed on injured reserve with an apparent shoulder injury and something that he needs to have surgery on. This is after Ross hurt his knee in the preseason, held him out of a couple games, had an issue on Thursday Night Football in his first game back where he fumbled the ball and did not have a single catch as a rookie. So really, since 2014, the Bengals' first-round picks have all had some form of a redshirt season. Darqueze Dennard ended up on IR, I believe, that year with some injuries. Cedric Ogbuehi only played a couple of games because they drafted him when he was hurt in 2015. William Jackson III, same deal. Now you got John Ross. And these are your first-round picks. These are supposedly the cornerstones of your team, especially a guy that's a number 9 pick. Your offense has been towards the bottom of the rankings this year. Again, it's one of those things where I kind of throw my hands up in the air and I say, is this Marvin, squashing another rookie season from a promising guy? I don't want to say they're making up an injury, because if they did, that would Ross would have grounds to essentially sue the team to put him on IR if he's not really injured. So, I think he's got something going on, but Ross was for weeks a healthy scratch, and now you go, okay, is this a Marvin thing? Is this a John Ross thing? Is it both? Should he have even been the pick at number 9 after a couple of receivers had already gone? You're muted, buddy.
Sorry, it's been a while after remember this whole mute thing. But yeah, and I think that's, I mean, we did this podcast live during the draft, and I remember when they drafted Ross, my recorded reaction was not very favorable. But, you know, once he's the pick, and you kind of live with it. And I think me and you probably both thought to varying degrees that Davis and Mike Williams, Corey Davis, who the Titans took, and Mike Williams, who the Chargers took, were probably players we preferred more for various reasons. That being said, you know, we're obviously not NFL scouts. We're not NFL coaches. We didn't go to the combine. We didn't do the interviews. We didn't go to the pro days. So when they draft John Ross, you know, they kind of come out, they say all the right things. He's a guy, we see a spot for him in our offense. And obviously it has to do with the speed. I mean, the 4.22 or whatever speed that broke the record. And okay, you know, there's clearly some goal they see using this guy. They drafted him. They knew he was hurt. They knew he was fragile, but they still saw that, okay, he's going to be our deep guy, our third wide out or whatever, you know, on three wide sets, that he's just going to run deep, you know, pull a safety, maybe, you know, open up the middle, open up something so we can get, you know, work guys like Eifert, you know, obviously going back to when he was still healthy, Green or, you know, LaFell kind of underneath, you know, somehow working him in. And so when you see him miss the first game or two, it's like, okay, I get that. He missed training camp, but then he misses another game and another game. And you keep hearing, well, he's healthy. He's practicing, but he's not playing. And the one challenging thing is, since we haven't been to practices, is it's obviously speculation, like with any good conspiracy theory. Is he not playing because they just realized, wow, this guy's just not as good as we thought he was, and we just kind of really whiffed on this pick? Or is it that traditional thing where it's like, oh, he's a rookie, we're afraid of rookies, we're not going to play him? Or was he truly just hurt all year, but healthy enough to kind of be a, you know, healthy scratch? Are they screwing with people by saying he's healthy when he's really not healthy? And to me, it actually kind of reminds me of the thing you mentioned about putting him on IR if he's not hurt. Kind of reminds me of the whole McCarron thing, because his rookie year, he was hurt for a while, missed part of the season. He was healthy enough to play later in the year. The Bengals decided they were going to keep McCarron on IR, just, you know, didn't have to burn a roster spot, just kind of stash him. And by doing that, that pushes his unrestricted free agency out a year. And of course, you have the whole thing now where McCarron's camp is trying to get that moved up a year, because they're kind of arguing, well, it's kind of crap. They put him on IR, but he really wasn't injured. So it'd be interesting to see if Ross is or isn't injured, and why he, you know, is going to IR. But the list you mentioned, yeah, it's very, it's, I mean, that first round list, it's just a litany of guys who just can't stay healthy. I mean, Eifert actually was healthy his first year. They just didn't use him. And then they finally used him his second year, and he gets hurt, the first offensive drive against Baltimore. Denard, as you mentioned, missed the whole year. Oboye, they drafted, who was hurt, and knew he was going to miss a year. William Jackson was kind of, I guess we got a double, you know, bang that year, because you had Andrew Billings drafted a few rounds later. And they both got hurt, you know, before the season began. And then, yeah, this whole John Ross scenario. And the John Ross thing, it's also very frustrating, because the year before they used a second round pick on Tyler Boyd. So in losing Marvin Jones, they've now used 2 picks in back-to-back drafts, high picks, you know, number 9 overall, and their second round pick on wide receivers. This year, I think they've targeted Boyd 15 times in 12 games or something like that. And as you mentioned with Ross, they've thrown the ball 0 times too. So it just makes you wonder what, you know, I'm not really sure how to put words to it. You know, what is this team doing when you're using back-to-back, you know, high picks on receivers, and then you don't play them? Are you just that bad at evaluating talent, and you're just going to keep dipping until you get it right? And it makes, as a fan, I'm very curious to see what happens when, you know, when the new coach comes in. What kind of playing time do these guys get? Are they really good and just not being used, or does it turn out they aren't that good, and that's why they're not playing, and we just can't see that because they're never on the field?
So that's the question I want to pose to you and to our listeners tonight, because for the saving grace of Marvin Lewis for many fans has been, oh, he's a good evaluator of talent, maybe doesn't get the most out of certain players, but drafts talented players, and you know, and since he has come to this team, the Bengals have really shied away from big free agency spending. The first couple of years when they were really rebuilding the roster, they had a couple of big signings, but again, those guys didn't really pan out. So I guess what it is either the team is very snake bitten and just cursed when it comes to injuries for good and high picks, or they're not doing their due diligence on these guys, their durability and all of that, or we're just overrating Marvin Lewis and the staff and the scouting staff and what they do in the draft. I don't want to go pick by pick for throughout the Marvin Lewis era because that's going to take forever, but I'm going to look at it. Obviously, 2003 draft, Carson Palmer, Eric Steinbach, Jeremy Johnson, the shining jewels of that, and I would think that most Bengals fans would say that those three guys. And I think if you have 7 or so picks in the draft, if you get 3 good players, a couple of starters, 3 or 4, I think you're pretty happy. But 2003, a couple of few good players there. You go to 2004, Chris Perry, Quan Ratliff, Mediu Williams. I mean, Mediu Williams was okay. Landon Johnson was okay. And then Robert Gathers in the 4th round. Okay, everybody else is a bunch of meh. 2005 had 3 of the most exciting yet disappointing picks, probably in Bengals history, and David Pollock, Odell Thurman, and Chris Henry. Everybody else, blah. Fanene actually had a decent career with the Bengals, 7th round pick, but nothing to write home about. 2006 draft, this one was pretty good. Joseph Whitworth, Rucker, Jamada Pecco. So, you got some good players there. 2007, this was a waste. Leon Hall, Kenny Irons, Marvin White. You did get Chinendum and Dukeway, but, I mean, he really didn't do much there. 2008, disaster all across the board. 2009 was pretty productive. Andre Smith, Ray Malaluga, Michael Johnson, Kevin Huber out of that. Bernard Scott as well. 2010 was probably the best, if not 2011. And then you get into, this is where I really wanted to focus, this 2011, because that's when the team started to shift things and they're focused. 2012, Drake Kirkpatrick, Kevin Zeitler. Well, Zeitler was a good pick. Kirkpatrick, my goodness, he had probably the worst game I've ever seen a professional cornerback have last week against the Steelers in a variety of respects. Mohamed Sanu, Marvin Jones, good picks. You didn't hang on to him. Zeitler, good pick. You didn't hang on to him. Aloka still with the team. Pretty decent draft, I guess, there. You have Eifert, Bernard, a couple of other. I mean, it's you just look through it, especially the top couple of picks, and it's a lot of blah or what could have been. So I guess I'd love to hear your assessment of these guys, these picks, especially 2011, because that's when this team had made that string of postseason berths and relied on this process. That's what they've told us. We're going to use the draft, not free agency, to build the team. And a lot of these picks, including John Ross so far, has blown up in their face.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the that's one of the things with the Bengals is, like you mentioned, they obviously are a team we build with the draft. We keep our own and we draft good guys. In theory, we don't really sign too much. And I've mentioned this in the past on several, I think, Since the Jungle articles, is this team was really built in the 2009, 2010, 2011 drafts. I mean, those are the drafts that they essentially nailed. Everything before then, everything after then has been, more of a disappointment than anything. They have had a lot of misses, but because they had a few really good drafts back to back to back, I think people kind of said, oh, yep, look at, especially when they started winning, because they were winning with that core they drafted in 9, 10, 11. They got a solid right tackle in Andre Smith, serviceable linebacker in Ray Malaluga. Michael Johnson was, decent as a defensive end. Kevin Huber's a good punter. The next year, getting Geno Atkins in the 4th round, not to mention Dunlap and Gresham. Say one about Gresham, he did make 2 Pro Bowls and was a good blocker. And then the next year, obviously, A.J. Green, Dalton, and then Bowling. So in that, 3-year span, they drafted essentially the core and most of the great players they had, on those playoff runs in 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. They were pretty much built during that little span when everyone's like, wow, look how great the Bengals are. Look how great they are at drafting. They drafted all these great guys And they did. The problem was they didn't follow that up. When you're going after Margus Hunt, Sean Porter, Devin Still, Brandon Thompson, Orson Charles, Will Clark, Russell Bodine, after that, when you're not following it up, the problem is, and we kind of saw it as fans, hey, at some point, these guys aren't all going to be here. We're hitting that 4-year window, 5-year window, when those rookie deals are up. And when that happens, we aren't going to have the money to pay them all. So we'd better be drafting guys to fill them in. And instead, that's where you'd see the Bengals kind of make these luxury picks, or kind of like, we don't really, we'll draft this one guy because he might be good at one thing, and because we have no needs. And at the time, they didn't have any needs because they had that core. But once that core got to free agency, they were able to keep a few, and they did, and then the rest all disappeared. We saw Kevin Zeitler go, we saw Marvin Jones, Andrew Whitworth finally left, et cetera, et cetera. And we've seen, now we're reaping the benefits the last couple of years of those drafts after that 2010, 2011 window, where they just weren't nailing them like they were. And so I think, during the playoff run, people were, understandably saying, hey, the Bengals do a great job drafting. They're a well-run organization. They're drafting good guys and keeping their own. And they did for that nice window. The problem was that window ended and they didn't keep it up. And unfortunately, I think whoever comes in and replaces Lewis is going to have to do that again. They're going to have to say, okay, there's the few people that we still have that are salvageable. We need to get back in there, and we need to hopefully have some good drafts and be able to turn this, correct some of these errors of, drafting Jake Fisher and Abuehi back-to-back to replace Andre Smith and Andrew Whitworth. And of course, that flops, and so forth and so forth. Or we'll just draft a cornerback and then not play him for 3 years. Or some of this other kind of nonsense. So, yeah, what it comes down to is they had that nice window, and then there was really nothing after that.
True. And, like I said, I don't want to go pick by pick in here, but I think there is a lot of reason for criticism, and I think that's what free agency is for. It's to supplement the draft. Now, before we talk about the Bears, we're going to do that quickly. Just one quick question for you, Scott. Your opinion between the disparity between Dre Kirkpatrick and William Jackson right now. Now, granted, William Jackson's sample size is very small. I did see on Pro Football Focus this week that against Antonio Brown, who many believe is the top receiver in the NFL, there has been 8 targets where William Jackson has covered Antonio Brown, 0 completions, and 4 of those passes defended. Now, if you watched the Monday Night Football game, one of those was in the end zone where it appeared Brown had the touchdown catch, and Jackson made a great play at the end to kind of snag it out of there and strip it out of his hands. To me right now, and this is no slight to Darqueze Dennard, who has been playing a lot, much improved football this year. To me right now, William Jackson III is playing like the team's best cornerback, whereas Dre Kirkpatrick is playing as maybe the 4th best cornerback on this team. Am I overreacting in terms of that, or I don't know?
To give a quick answer, I would say no. Without a doubt, at least from what I've seen, from the eye test that I've seen on my TV. Now, granted, I don't have a big fancy TV, so maybe not looking at things right. William Jackson and Dennard, I think, have been 2 of the best cornerbacks this year. I would throw in Jones, but he's been hurt quite a bit, hasn't played as much. But yeah, Kirkpatrick, he just, and granted, he sat forever. So, for his first few years, we really didn't see much of him. When he did get in there, he was one of these guys who seemed to get burned, and then he would also come back and have like a couple great plays. You're like, wow, this guy's a stud. And then you'd see him get burned for a touchdown, and then you'd see, wow, look at this great. So he was one of these guys who seemed kind of hit and miss. This year, it's mostly been miss. He hasn't had those big plays that excite you, those interceptions, those like plays make you go, wow, this guy's he's using his length, he's using his speed, he's playing great cornerback. You're just not seeing that, and so you're kind of glad that you're getting William Jackson in there. And after all these years, Dennard is finally looking like a NFL cornerback, because Dennard and William Jackson, I think, are the 2 best, and without them there, you have to wonder, well, how much worse could they be? Because Kirkpatrick hasn't looked good. And granted, like you said, Antonio Brown is a very good receiver. that may not be the best player for Kirkpatrick to be covering. He's a very quick guy. And I don't know if, Kirkpatrick needs to cover certain types of guys, the bigger, taller, the maybe more the Demaryius Thomas types and less of the Antonio Brown. Maybe we just need to say he's a square peg, round hole thing. Let's find the guys he can cover better in theory and only cover them. But yeah, watching some of the games we watch with him, it's like, it just seems like he's getting burned way too frequently for someone who, was signed to that big, was $53 million or whatever deal that you expect that from a shutdown top guy, not from a guy, like you said, who's, looking third or fourth and probably battling with Josh Shaw to even have that, that title on the team.
Absolutely awful game from Dre Kirkpatrick on Monday night. Got trucked by Le'Veon Bell when he tried to square him up for a tackle. Had 2 long pass interference penalties against Antonio Brown and was on coverage when Antonio Brown caught the game-tying touchdown against the Bengals. So awful game there, whereas William Jackson kind of locked him down there. I saw a comment on our YouTube chat by Dark Sealer 1995. Jackson is a lockdown corner and Denard is a lockdown corner. You don't need Jones. Only reason I say keep Kirkpatrick is his contract. That contract is, that's kind of going to be an albatross for the Bengals going forward. I do like the idea of, Denard kind of being the Leon Hall type, William Jackson being the Jonathan Joseph type. And when those two were in their primes with the Bengals, they played very well. But I think William Jackson, even though we talked about, the misses and the injuries and all of this to the Bengals, picks of late, I think William Jackson lately has really stepped up. He had that weird play on Monday night where he kind of olayed Le'Veon Bell, and I think he thought he went out of bounds. That was obviously kind of a brain fart there, but in terms of coverage and all of that, I think, and he squared up Juju Smith-Schuster for a nice tackle that was a minimal gain. So I think the future is very bright for William Jackson. What do you think? Get in touch with us, iTunes, SoundCloud, YouTube. We're on Twitter at Bengals OBI, and we're also on Cincy Jungle. You can get in touch with us via email, the obinsider@gmail.com. I know, Scott, we're kind of running a little short on time. We're going to try and get to we're going to try and get to some listener questions if we can at the end. But obviously, let's move on from the Steelers. The game's in the rearview mirror now. The Bengals basically need to focus on what's ahead of them. It's basically 3 NFC North games and 1 AFC North game. It's the Bears this week, and then Lions, Vikings, and Ravens. Oh my! So the Bears are this week. The Bears are playing pretty awful football. However, Chicago was one of the 2 losses that Pittsburgh suffered this year, believe it or not, and so they've kind of got a scrappy nature. I'm going to lean on you a little bit this week because for those of you who don't know on this podcast, if you just tune into this podcast and not necessarily cincyjungle.com, Scott writes up a couple of weekly features at cincyjungle.com, including one that's called, quote unquote, Behind Enemy Lines, where he talks with a fellow blogger of the opposition that the Bengals are facing that respective week.
As he mentioned, I had a chance to speak with Jeff Burks of the Windy City Gridiron folks over, which is the SB Nation site for the Chicago Bears. Had a chance to discuss a few things with them, and that's probably one of the good things about when you discuss with some of these other teams who are struggling is you don't feel as bad about how your current team is doing. And that's something that seems to be happening with the Bears. They are just going the wrong direction in so many ways. And talking to them, they do have some positives, some negatives. One positive they do have is a guy named Akeem Hicks. And it's very interesting. It's kind of like what we had with Chris Smith and with Wallace Gilberry a few years ago. He bounced around a couple of different teams. All of a sudden, he went to the Bears and has become a great sack artist. He had a career high of 4.5 sacks. All of a sudden, last year he had 7 with the Bears. This year he has 7 in only 11 games. So he's clearly doing something right. And so that, for me, that's going to be an exciting matchup to see Cedric Ogbuehi, who finally is looking, he's looking pretty decent. And now we have a good pass rusher who has kind of emerged. So I'm really looking forward to the opportunity to see what can Abwehi do? Is he going to continue to improve? Are we seeing a new Abwehi? Is he getting better? Can he hold Akeem Nicks? Nicks. Keep on to call him Hicks. Or is Abwehi kind of a I don't know, something of a aberration because he hasn't gone up against great pass rushers? So that'll be an interesting. The other interesting thing is we've had a lot of complaints about the Bengals handling of the kicking situation. They kept Mike Nugent way too long, as many people have said. They finally got rid of him. They drafted a kicker this year, the first kicker taken in the draft, which was Elliott out of Memphis. They brought him in. They called it a competition. They kept Randy Bullock. Bullock had a great camp, and a surprise to many people, they ended up cutting he ended up cutting Elliott, put him on practice squad. The Eagles scooped him up. He's had a good year, not a perfect year. He has missed a couple extra points and some field goals, but he's nailed 5 or 6 50-yarders and a couple 60-yarders. So he's having a outstanding year as far as a rookie kicker would go. And the Bengals have complained because obviously Bullock has been less than perfect this year. As bad as that's been, the Bears situation has been far worse. You look at what's happened with them. They started with Robbie Gould. They let him go for some reason a couple years ago. They brought Barth in. Connor Barth was horrible. They cut him. They signed Cairo Santos to replace him. He makes 1 or 2 kicks, and then he goes on IR. And interestingly, the Bears kicker for this week is Mike Nugent. So if nothing else, that's definitely something to watch for this week is, Mike Nugent. Bengals are playing him, I think, for the first time since he was let go. I think he bounced around to the Giants and maybe the Cowboys or somewhere in Texas and has come back. So that'll be a very interesting thing to see what happens there with that situation.
Obviously, the big story for the Bears is, do they have a viable quarterback option? And they've been looking for a quarterback for a very long time. Mitch Trubisky, a shade under 55% completion percentage, 5 touchdowns, 4 interceptions, 8 fumbles. And it's not just him. The team is devoid of a lot of talent, and I think John Fox is kind of in a similar situation as Marvin Lewis in terms of kind of a lot of people would like to see him go. So, I think overall this should be this should be a game that the Bengals should walk through and probably will play pretty angry, and I think they'll handle them pretty well. I'd say 24-13. What do you think, Scott?
I'd say, yeah, I guess let's try and decide what I want to say. Is I'm not really thinking a number. I don't know if it's better if we lose or win. I guess if I was going to go with a number, it's a game we should win. Their offense has been horrible. Their points, their yards. Trubisky's had some down numbers. And that's another interesting was discussing the quarterback situation, because obviously the Bears traded up for Trubisky and passed on Deshaun Watson, who obviously had an incredible season before he got hurt. Obviously passed up on taking Mahomes or Deshaun Kaiser, and they could have sat and taken one of them, and so they didn't. So their offense has been a mess. Their defense has been adequate, I guess. They do have some good running backs. Their offensive line, I think, has struggled mightily, and they just put Kyle Long on IR. So it's a game the Bengals should win pretty easy. 20 plus points, 25 points to 6 or 24-6 or something. The more interesting thing is, I think the bigger battle is, you mentioned the Bears wanting to get rid of John Fox. The Bengals are probably getting rid of Marvin Lewis. That means these two teams are, in theory, fighting for the same head coaches. They're going to be going over the same folks. And that being the case, I think an argument could probably be made that it's better to, and I know the Bengals would never do it, let Marvin Lewis go before the season ends, or at the very least, do everything you would if you had let him go. So normally when you let a guy go, let's say week 12, you're spending the next 4 weeks figuring out, what do we have in these coaches? What do we have in these players? Let's chat with these players and find out, what did the coach do right? What did he do wrong? What do we need in the next head coach? Where did we drop the ball? Start our searching, start, vetting some people out, start, interviewing, start discussing, start looking at options. If you want to keep Lewis for this final 4 games as a lame duck, that's fine, but don't wait till after then to begin all that stuff. You need to begin all that stuff right now, because you mentioned the Bears are going to be, and the Bears aren't probably aren't going to be the only team looking. I mean, the odds are, every year you have teams that win a lot of games and teams that don't win many games. And the teams that don't win many games are generally looking for a new coach. The Browns seem to do it every few years. There's a chance, 1 in 26, Hugh Jackson or whatever he is now, could possibly be one of those. You don't know. Some people are saying Jay Gruden may even be on the chopping block because they're under 500 since he's been there. So you don't know how many other teams out there are going to be looking for a head coach. The Giants obviously are looking for a head coach. They're able to start a little early. So, once, January 1st or whatever hits, and week 17 ends, the Giants technically have like a 1 month head start on the Bengals as far as who they want to go after. So the Bengals, for me, I don't know if it's more important than winning the game. Maybe not more important than winning, but one thing they need to make sure they're doing right now and not saying, okay, we're not bringing back Marvin Lewis. Now we begin. They have to begin that right now because you're fighting with the Giants, the Bears, and whoever else to get this next head coach, whoever he's going to be. And odds are, if you think he's good, other people may think he's good too. I mean, obviously, people thought our assistants were good because they took them all away. They took away, Zimmer and Gruden and Vance Joseph and Hugh Jackson and so forth. And so that's something the Bengals obviously need to do is begin that head coach search right away. So my prediction for the game is let Marvin Lewis coach it. Whatever we score. But start that coaching search, if that makes sense, as soon as possible.
Not a bad theory, and obviously a team that the Bengals play a little later in the season, the Detroit Lions, might be looking for another head coach, especially depending on how that game turns out. So I think we're in agreement that the Bengals should hand it to the Bears this week at Paul Brown Stadium. We'll see. Scott, we've got a couple of questions. I understand it's a little late for you, so if you want to stick around, feel free, my friend. If not, got a couple of quick questions I can address, and one is a good segue for what you were talking about head coaching search and all of that. And it was an email from our good friend Kevin Evans, who I believe is twin brothers with Keith Evans, and they are from the Bahamas. So really cool to hear from them, if I remember correctly. But essentially, they're asking about Paul Guenther's job as a defensive coordinator being safe. Obviously, there's a lot of late collapses: Green Bay, Tennessee, Pittsburgh, and a lot of he's saying this team could very well be 8-4 instead of 5-7 if not for those collapses, or somewhere in between. And I don't disagree with him. What I worry about is Paul Guenther being a head coaching candidate for this team. No, I'm not saying I think he's worthy, because I don't think he is. I'm not saying he's not worthy of being a defensive coordinator in the NFL either. There's been some good things with him, but I don't want to see the Bengals promote from within. I think they stumbled over their own 2 feet with Ken Zampese being promoted to offensive coordinator. That blew up in their face. I think that Guenther is a guy that is more of an assistant coach type of guy in the NFL. His ceiling is probably what is going on with the Bengals as defensive coordinator. He has been a head coaching candidate before, but I don't think he's been a serious candidate for other teams. If in terms of in 2018, if his job is safe, I think that depends totally on who the coach is. I think if the Bengals hire a new coach outside of Marvin Lewis, I think that coach brings in an entire new staff, or largely a new staff, especially at the coordinator level. I don't know what you think, Scott.
Yeah, I'd say with Guenther, I'm torn, because on the one hand, you kind of want the idea of, okay, we'd have 15 years of Lewis. We just need to clean house, sweep through. And you can't really do that if you promote from within, because then you're probably keeping a lot of their people there. You're keeping the culture and a lot of their things. And if you really want to start over, you're starting over. On the other hand, if he is the best candidate, and I don't know if he is, if he turns out, let's say they interview a dozen people or whatever, and they say, without a doubt, this guy seems to be the best candidate, I wouldn't want them to pass on him just because he's on the current staff. Now, that being said, I think one of the interesting things is I think it's going to be very hard for us fans to know who the best candidates are, because you can look at a guy who does great as a coordinator. For example, Dick LeBeau is a great defensive coordinator, but coach of the Bengals wasn't a very good head coach. And as you mentioned, some of these people are very good at what they do, at their task. Defensive coordinator, offensive coordinator, looking at the X's and O's, breaking down the opposition, looking at the things they do well, what they don't do well. How are we going to maximize the players we have? How are we going to attack their weaknesses? Those kind of things. That's what the coordinator does. The head coach does some of that, but a lot of what they do is very different, because they're trying to manage a dozen different coaches, 50 players. They're looking at the draft, they're looking at evaluating talent, the practice squad. How are we going to coordinate this all together? How are we going to schedule? Like, the biggest things that seems like a coach does is they need to have the energy, the intensity, the guy that's going to charge the players up, get the most out of them. Kind of like not just a motivator, but kind of like a Caesar. I'm a general who's going to take charge, jump in for you. Everyone's going to fight for me. Get the most out of these guys, but can also do the X's and O's. But you have the assistants to help you with all that. So you have to find the guy who can do all those things. And it's hard for us to know, without meeting these people, who are these guys who can really fire these players up, who can take control of a locker room. And that's one of the interesting things. One of our assistants, Vance Joseph, one of the things I've heard from some of the Bengals or some of the Broncos insiders is that they aren't really sold on Joseph. I guess he sold them in the interviews, but as a head coach, doesn't have control of the locker room, doesn't hold players accountable, doesn't seem to have any of those qualities. So yeah, it's very hard for us to know. I would be okay with Gunther if they determine that he's the best candidate because he has those abilities. I don't know if he does. Obviously, losing the games late where the defense gave up points, and I'm still kind of stuck on how much that is the defense versus how much that is the offense going 3 and out, 3 and out, 3 and out, 3 and out. So you're constantly putting your defense in a position where at some point they're going to give up points because you just aren't holding on the ball. You're constantly giving the ball over. You're constantly, putting the defense back on the field. Well, at some point they're going to break. You just can't keep putting your defense out there and expect them to hold time and time again.
To me, I just want somebody new. If they're not going to stick with Lewis, I think they need to go outside and get a new staff from the outside, just a different outside perspective. It worked last time, at least to a certain extent, when they went outside with Marvin Lewis, and I think it's time for that again. Let's use the final thought for this question and then get out of here, Scott, quickly, because I know it's late on your end, my friend. Another question we had was, we talked about the Bengals draft history, especially high picks. Couple of positions that you think the Bengals should draft high this year when it comes to their needs and what you've seen this year.
That one, real quick off the top of my head, and this would probably change if I thought about it for a minute or two. I'm going to say, it really depends on who the best players are at where they're picking. One position they need to address is interior of the offensive line. Center has been a weakness forever. Our right tackle right now, I think, is Andre Smith and Eric Winston. I think that's got to change. Those guys are both very old. Obuehi, I'm hoping we see signs from him. So I'd say anywhere on the offensive line is clearly a concern and something needs to be addressed. But the one thing I could see, and I'm not opposed if they do this at all, would be quarterback. Taking a quarterback early. And the main reason I'm saying that is because you have Dalton on a very team-friendly deal. You kind of know what his limitations are, what he can do. This is supposed to be a great quarterback draft in theory. All these guys coming out, Rosen and Darnold and Hill and so forth, and Lamar Jackson and, the Baker Mayfield and whatever. If those guys go through the process, the Senior Bowl, the Combine, the Pro Days, all that, and we determine that, there's 5 or 6 legitimate first-round picks here, and they are, in theory, better than Dalton, I'd say, this is a quarterback league. I'd say draft one of the quarterbacks. So I'd say that is a position they need to address if it turns out there is a, Peyton Manning, Andrew Luck, type guy in there who falls to them. Kind of like when Aaron Rodgers fell and the Packers went and scooped him up when they had Brett Favre. If he's, if that guy's there, I'd say that's the guy you go after.
Player, and also that probably depends on who the coach is at that point, and if they want to stick with Andy Dalton or not. Andy Dalton has been at fault for a few losses this year, but not the main reason. I think it's been coaching and a lot of other issues. Obviously, I agree with Scott with the interior of the offensive line as major issues that need to be addressed. I think the meat of this team, the Bengals have always been at least under Marvin Lewis and Mike Brown, they get enamored with the skill positions. They like the outside, and then they kind of build in. I'd rather see them do the opposite this year and probably have what most would consider to be a bland draft in terms of positions and all of that. A couple of positions I want to note that are sneaky needs: tight end, perhaps cornerback, based on what we've seen in terms of age from Adam Jones and struggles from Dre Kirkpatrick. We don't know. Safety could be another. So a couple of positions where you sit and you go, oh, the Bengals are kind of set there. You never know. Eifert's situation is up in the air. Croft has stepped up this year. Uzama, who last year stepped up nicely, has not done as much this year. So I don't know. I've got a crying baby in the background. I love my life, my friends. Thank you so much for tuning in. This is the Orange and Black Insider Bengals podcast. You can get this podcast on iTunes, on SoundCloud, on YouTube, on CincyJungle.com. You can get in touch with us via Twitter at BengalsOBI and via email, theobinsider@gmail.com. Obviously, Kevin Evans got in touch with us to give a question via email tonight, so we appreciate that. We appreciate all the interaction in the YouTube chat. Join us live every episode when we record. We'd love to have you. And if not, like I said, download it on various platforms. We appreciate the support. Hey, I know things aren't looking great for the Bengals right now at 5-7. You know, you got to just hope that not only that they maybe turn things around and sneak into the postseason this year, highly unlikely, or that they make the proper changes to have long-term success. Again, don't know how big of faith we have in that based on ownership at this point, but we'll see. Again, Orange and Black Insider Bengals podcast. For Scott Schulte, I'm Anthony Cosenza. Thanks a bunch, everybody.